Hi, my name is Winona Ryman Richmond, and I'm honored to be here with Roland Chilton to do an interview with the Oral Histories Project. We're at the American Society of Criminology meetings in 2003 in Atlanta. And just a little bit of background about Roland. Roland is a former president of the American Society of Criminology. He also was a staff of the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, and he taught at the University of Massachusetts Amherst for 40 years. Hey, Roland, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you became a criminologist?
Yes, and I think the best way to describe it is that it was a series of lucky breaks. And I'm going to try to remember as many as I can. But I want to start with one, having lived through the 20th century, one of the luckiest breaks was being born a white male. And that said, putting that aside, the next really lucky break was being born and growing up in the city of Chicago. And there are all kinds of things that could be said about why Chicago, is a great place to live, even as a poor kid. I mean, the lake, the museums, the parks, the schools. I mean, there was just so many good things in living there, even during the Great Depression. Because I was a child of the Great Depression. My father came to Chicago in the 20s to help build the city. I mean, it was a tremendous growth that came up from Missouri. I was born just a month before, just a month after the crash, and so we lived through the Great Depression, which he was unemployed a great deal. But even under those circumstances, it was a great place to be. And so, and there's another aspect to this, and I'm going to have to get to the second point to soften this. One of the things about growing up in Chicago is that you become, I'll say, skeptical, very skeptical. And it sometimes borders on cynicism. In fact, I think when I run into cynical people, I figure I can out-cynical them. It's just a sense that everybody's on the make, everybody's hustling, everybody's trying to make a fix of some kind. So you have that sense, and you can't, I don't think, really grow up in the city and have the experiences that a lot of poor kids have without realizing that. But that said, there are a lot of very decent people, and there are a lot of very altruistic people that come into the city to do good, and that was, and I don't know if people know that. Maybe it doesn't happen anymore, but I want to get to that point. But to get to that point, to talk about those people, I have to talk about the family moving around. That is, my sister Julie interviewed my mother at one point and said, and my mother said, "Oh yeah, for the first 21 years of my married life, we moved 18 times." Now, this is the Great Depression, and a lot of those moves, they put the furniture on the street. And this sounds, my wife hates it when I talk about this because it sounds like I'm kind of pouring it or outpouring people. But I'm sure it must have been hard for my parents, but for us, it was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. I mean, you come home and the stuff's on the street, and you say, "Hey, we're going to move again." You go to another neighborhood. So we live. The glib answer to that question, the short answer to the question, how did I become a criminologist? I usually say to people when they say that, I say, "Well, I grew up on the west side of Chicago," and that seems to satisfy them. It seems to it makes sense or something. But the truth is, we lived all over Chicago, and we lived on the north side. We lived on the west side near, almost every house I lived in has been torn down. But for good reason. I mean, they expanded the Chicago Circle campus and built the hospital and so on. So the Hermitage Street house is probably gone. We lived on the south side right up till the beginning of the war. And when I say the war, people my age mean World War II. Now we've had a whole bunch of wars against poverty, wars against drugs, wars against terror. I mean, these are all kind of odd wars to those of us who kind of remembered World War II. And so but the point was, we then moved to the near northwest side, and this was a big break because we were 2 doors down from Erie Neighborhood House. And Erie Neighborhood House there are a whole set of settlement houses that were set up in Chicago. And the most famous one is Hull House, of course, everybody knows that. But not too far north and west of us was Northwestern Settlement House. And just west of us, almost on Erie Street, or maybe on Erie Street, was Emerson House. And south and east of us, there was the Chicago Commons, which was the University of Chicago's settlement house. But in the middle of that, there was Erie Neighborhood House. And it was founded by a woman in Florence Town who, I think there's almost no other name for her, that she was a saint. I mean, she could hustle money outside the city to build this this thing and bring people in to help people that lived there. So, living next to Erie, and then we moved a couple of times, but just once to go a little farther from Erie, and then back right next door to Erie. And in all that time, there were people there that were, as they say, very altruistic people. I don't think they made a lot of money. I'm sure they didn't make a lot of money. Some of them were volunteers, and their idea was to help the neighbors, as Miss Florence Town called them. We used to call her Miss Florence. That was the, that's what she had, this really high-pitched voice and great head of white hair, and and anyway, she hired some really good people. One person they hired, since one of the things that these are all religiously oriented people, you have to understand it. So they came in to preach the gospel. They came in to save souls, and then I think they saved a lot of our lives instead, or maybe in the process, I don't know. But anyhow, they were religiously oriented people. So when she built the neighborhood house, part of the neighborhood house, almost a separate structure, was the Erie Chapel Presbyterian Church. And so, but they weren't always able to get Presbyterian ministers that want to work there, I guess. And so they had the kind of pulpit supply. But one of the people they brought in was a man named Doug Cedarleaf, and he came from Rockford, Illinois, and he was the minister of the church, but he's also, for a while, a youth leader. So we would meet every Sunday night and talk about a whole host of things, but what those meetings were, and I didn't realize it until I got to Wisconsin and Indiana, those were seminars. and he would take a topic and he would really probe it, and we would talk about it. And one of my friends said, "Oh, I hate these meetings. I can't sleep afterwards." And I said, "Well, maybe that's the point. He really wants us to think about these things." So Doug Cedarleaf really set our feet in the right direction, but it didn't mean we always went that way. And so, the chronological literature about in fact, some of the best of it, I guess I'll get to it in the next set, where Al Cohen tries to describe this kind of tension between kids who are not equipped to impress middle-class people, and middle-class people who are trying their best to get them into the mainstream, and there's a tension and almost resentment sometimes. And so, with not just Cedarleaf, but there was a man named Ted Roos said to me one day, he said, "Have you thought about college?" And I said, "What are you talking about? Poor boys don't go to college." And he said, "Well, think about it." So we left it at that. And then another guy came in who was a seminarian. He was at Union Theological Seminary in Chicago, but he was either voluntary time or part-time, or I never thought about them as being paid people. It just seemed to me they were there, And but this was a fellow named Jack Urey, and he'd gone to Monmouth College. So at the time when I did start to think about college, it was just a fluke, because I had gone to this assembly where various people from various colleges would talk to people that were graduating from Crane Technical High School. And so I kind of went, because then you got out of class or something, and I was sitting there, and everybody's getting up and they're talking about how much it cost and what it takes and to get in, and the guy from Chicago City Junior Colleges said, "All you need is $10 and a high school diploma." So, okay, that sounds better than going to work. So let's do that. I mean, I did go to work because I had always had part-time jobs in high school. One of the great breaks of the war for kids who were, say, 14, 15, is they took so many people out, took them to other countries, and that there were jobs. You could get a job, almost anywhere. So I kind of always had kind of my own spending money, and always worked. But I wasn't eager to do those things full time at that point. I don't know why. Anyway, I was interested in school, and Wright Junior College was very good, because there were a couple of people that really impressed me. One was named Shabbat, and the other Weinberg. can't remember the first names. They wrote a book together, and they taught the social science surveys at Wright. In fact, they were graduate students at University of Chicago, and they just stole the curriculum, and they just took the content and they gave it to us, and it was great. So, but after finishing Wright, the question was where to go to the next 2 years, and since growing up in Chicago, you'd think you never leave. You don't think about leaving Chicago. I mean, that doesn't come across your mind. So I was thinking maybe I'll go to Roosevelt College and finish it. But Jack Urey said, no, you should go to Monmouth College. It's a little school in Western Illinois. And he actually paved the way. So when I got there, I had jobs, a job washing dishes, and then while I worked in the library, mopping the floors. I had a great job in the courthouse, where we lived in the jail. And it was, this had nothing to do with criminology, but I mean, it was a cell off of the sheriff's home, but it was part of the jail. They just didn't lock the door. And then we kind of filled the hopper. I'm digressing here. The point was, I got to Monmouth, I got the degree. So that connection with Erie was a real break. Obviously, big break in my life. And the fact that the people of the city of Chicago were willing to pay taxes for a school system that would provide us with an education in the midst of the Depression that would go through junior college, was a tremendous help. And then, of course, since the people at Monmouth, I think they really wanted to help too. And but it was, I'm sure it was Jack Urey and his contact with Sam Thompson, who was professor of philosophy. And so I was a philosophy major at Monmouth. And this will get me to the point where I'll stop and see if I said something to confuse you.
No, excellent. Can you tell me more about influences decide to continue to go to graduate school after
that's
your bachelor's?
That's another set of lucky breaks. When I finished Monmouth, I had been deferred because there was a draft for the Korean War, and I'd been deferred. But as soon as I finished college, then I was drafted. But that was a lucky break. It may not sound like much of a lucky break, but I was actually allocated to the United States Marine Corps. That may not sound like a lucky break, but going through boot training, it was just such a transformation. I mean, just sent to San Diego and you get out and the sun is shining and there are palm trees, and it was just, there is something other than Chicago. But the organization of the thing was so well organized and so well run that even though I might have been, because of Doug Cedarleaf's influence, a kind of pacifist, but not a really courageous pacifist, but I'd rather be drafted than go to prison, I guess. So but the organization was so straightforward. I mean, they were really clear about what your job was, and it wasn't to get killed; it was to kill people. And so they trained you to do that, and it was a tremendous confidence builder. And so I decided at one point, part of the lucky break was being assigned after boot camp, not to the advanced infantry training, but to San Francisco, California. So the Marine Corps, you're familiar with the area.
Absolutely.
The Marine Corps Supply Depot on 100 Harrison Street in downtown San Francisco. Now the duty wasn't very good. You're standing in the middle of the night guarding a supply depot, staring up at the Bay Bridge, and it was kind of boring. But the liberty was great because you'd go up the top of Nob Hill and there'd be a servicemen's center in the bottom of the Fairmount, and they'd give you free tickets to movies and plays, and you'd meet people, especially young women, which was nice. And so anyway, it was just a tremendous break. But I decided that it was kind of boring. The duty was kind of boring, and since I had the degree from Monmouth, I was eligible to put in for officer candidate screening course. So I put in for the course and then went through the screening course in Quantico and got commissioned. And then I never went to Korea. So this is why I say
another lucky break.
It was another lucky break. It was like it was just a tremendous education. It really was. The boot camp education was really worked on fitness and mentality, and to convince you that there are things you could do you didn't know you could do, and actually when you finish you think there's nothing you can't do. So it was a really, that was a kind of education. But talking about people who want to make you middle class, the Marine Corps made you middle class by giving you more money. and by, no, and by you know, explicit training, you know, about things like, well, when you go to the colonel's house, you should have some little cards printed, and you know, and you leave a little card in the silver tray, and it would have been even if it hadn't been wartime, it would have been even more training for being middle class, because with the wartime they took out the horsemanship and all ballroom dancing, but we were able to do without that, and so anyway, but the big thing was, to get to the point, how did I get to graduate school? Well, the big thing was I was aboard ship once, and people kept calling me Bill, and I said, who's this guy Bill? So I looked him up, and it turned out a fellow named Bill Benson. He didn't think he looked anything like me, but I thought, well, there must be some similarity, resemblance. But anyway, we talked, we got to be friends. So when I told him I was going to go to graduate school, I was thinking about graduate school after I got out of the Marine Corps, he said, well, if you're going to go to graduate school, go to the University of Wisconsin. He was from Wisconsin. And then, even better, he said, there's a summer conference ground, summer camp on Lake Geneva. Since you're getting out early, you could work there, you go up to Madison.
That sounds great, yeah.
It was wonderful, because at that conference ground, the staff were all college students, and and 2/3 of them were women. And that's where I met Elizabeth Seaman. And that was a really big break, because that, you know, it's no exaggeration to say, if I talk about the people that helped me, I got more help from Elizabeth Seaman Chilton than any other living person.
And how many years have you and Elizabeth made?
Well, we have to wait till 2016 for it to be 60 years. And but that was, you know, that came out of being drafted and meeting somebody who sent me in the right direction. But you know, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I had but I was exposed to all these social workers. We call them social workers. They're, you know, they were the people at Erie, and I mean, they weren't trained social workers. I probably would, you know, the more I learned about trained social workers, I might not have been so impressed. But these were people that wanted to help people, and so I said, you know, I thought I should go into something that does that, and I thought maybe being a correctional administrator would be a way to help people. Sounds a little odd. I don't know what I was thinking about, but at any rate, the fact is, the Wisconsin had a joint program in corrections and sociology. So it was run by sociology and the School of Social Work. And so I joined that program. And so then I didn't have an undergraduate major in sociology, so I had to take additional courses. Oh, I forgot the main thing, the really big break about going into the Marine Corps. I got the GI Bill when I finished, and it was like a World War II type GI Bill, where you get books and a monthly stipend, and they pay the tuition, and you had to go wherever you want. And so, I mean, that's how I could actually afford Wisconsin. So I really think what you really need to become middle class is some money. And you know, and since the GI Bill provided the money, you could get the education. So now that didn't make me the greatest scholar, but I'll get to that in a minute. I mean, I wasn't really applying myself in some ways. You can imagine. I don't know. Have you ever been on the campus of the University of Wisconsin?
I have.
You know, I mean, can you imagine, you know, suddenly finding yourself there and thinking, what a wonderful place with the Lake Mendota.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful campus, and you know, so it's kind of hard to apply yourself. And so,
distracted by other
yeah,
things.
distracted by other things, and even after I got married, it still was just a lot of fun. And so, but with that GI Bill, I could get a degree, and that's, I mean, to become a criminologist, you need the education, and to get the education, you need the money. So anyway, obviously we'll talk about it later, but one of my lifetime interests has been in social class, because it.
Yeah.
But I'm not. I had a colleague. He was so fixated on it. But he was so determined, you know, to be middle class that it preyed on him. You know, it was like it was something he really was concerned about, and I don't think I'm really concerned about it, but I think studying it from a distance, you can kind of
Well, I can definitely see the connections between your upbringing in Chicago and the Erie House, and then the military and the structure it provided, and some of the middle class values.
The middle class values, and this is, I guess when I got to Wisconsin, maybe I should quickly move ahead, because once I got to Wisconsin, I started taking courses with Marshall Clenard, and on the correction side was a guy named Mike Hakeem. And I really liked Mike Hakeem because he was really a down-to-earth guy, and he set up what I don't know what it was supposed to be, a data collection operation or an internship, but he set up I guess it'd be an internship at the Federal Reformatory in Chillicothe, Ohio. And that experience with the treatment staff and their cynicism, I mean, I was talking about growing up in Chicago, you become cynical, but their view of the prisoners was so low, and I thought, well, how could I go into work like this? Because I would soon become as hardened and to believe that the prisoners were all con artists, and they're lying and you can't trust them, you can't do anything. And I thought, no, but in addition to that, they gave me a teaching assistantship, and I realized that I was really enjoying talking to these kids, and they were going to pay me for it. so that was a it kind of changed the course. And so instead of staying in the corrections program or social work, I switched over to sociology to become a criminology, well, basically a sociology major with an interest in crime, because of the impact of Marshall Clenard. But Mike Hakeem directed my master's thesis, and must have drove him crazy because I kept putting, spelling offense like, with an S instead of a C or something. And it was just, there were just certain bad habits I picked up as I was growing up. And we didn't have the personal computers that correct your spelling as you go. But anyhow, the other thing about Hakeem is that he used to say, look out for these 100%ers. These people who grab you by the lapel and tell you they have the answer to crime. And that was really helpful advice, because there are so many of them, and they're not all in business. They're in business, but they're not. Some of them are in criminology. they want to, so you put that with the skepticism that I had to begin with, and I think it was healthy. It was good, because then while I was impressed with the theory that I was reading, with Clenard especially, I still had in the back of my mind the notion is, can you test this? Can you use your senses, or some extension of your senses, to see it? Can you really trust it? So, at any rate, that was the other important thing at Wisconsin was when I gathered the data down at the reformatory and came back to campus, Mike Hakeem said, well, you better go to Bob McGinnis, he'll tell you what to do with it. how to do it. And although we had statistics classes, and I thought they were interesting, but I couldn't see what they had to do with sociology. And so, but McGinnis, he said, well, what's the theory, or what's the hypothesis? What are you looking for? And I said, well, I don't know. I said I had some rough idea about auto thieves, and so I was going to talk to auto thieves, and I did talk to auto thieves. But my idea that they'd be interested in cars and driving and stuff was just shot when I met the kid that was one of 5 kids who jumped into a car and drove it across the bridge from Indiana to Kentucky, and they became federal offenders. 6 months to 6 years, and so he couldn't even drive. So. There were other auto thieves I talked to who saw themselves as professional. But anyway, it was a useful experience to go to Chillicothe, and Mike Hakeem said, keep your nose clean. He worked in a prison. He had very little use for prison psychiatrists. He thought they did more harm than good, I think, and he'd written about it. But at any rate, when I got to talk to McGinnis, he said, wait a minute, you're supposed to have some idea, and not just sort of gather data. So I took an idea that had to do, I was interested in whether people specialize in crime and so on. And it wasn't an earth-shaking finding that they don't specialize, but in the process, he introduced me to automatic data processing equipment by teaching me how to use what was then a big deal, just well, actually, it wasn't before. It was before computers, but Wisconsin had a computer, but we didn't deal with that at that point. And we ran the statistical sorter and the old Frieden's, the electrical calculators to do the chi-squares and stuff. So I did the master's thesis, and then decided that it would probably be good to move on, to go someplace else, even though Clinard really urged me to stay on, but wouldn't guarantee support. And so I wrote I wrote about 3 places, and got a nice letter from the UCLA, and because Don Cressy had been a visiting professor at Wisconsin, so I had met Cressy, he was a smart, entertaining guy. So I wrote him and asked him about joining their program at UCLA, and I got back a really nice letter, long, detailed letter about the program. But I kept looking, and there was no mention of money. So I got a less lengthy letter from Indiana with money. But going to Indiana was another big break. I mean, it was really an enormous big break, and I want to focus on, before I get lost, I want to focus on two parts of it. One was the law school, and outside minor in law. But you had to take an outside minor in something outside of sociology. So you could take 15 hours in the law school. And I'd already been exposed to Jerome Hall by Clinard, who introduced me to Hall's book, Theft, Law, and Society. And so the law school was a big influence. The other was that I got an assistantship in the computer center. And that has to rank right up there with some of the biggest breaks, because honestly I learned to actually program the computer. And that, I think it's fair to say that without the computer, I could have done almost none of the things, not that it's all that much I've done, but I mean, none of the things I did would have been possible without the computer. So that assistantship was a tremendous, and so going to Indiana, making the change in Indiana, because also Indiana was a place where Sutherland had moved from the University of Chicago and set up a tremendous criminology program. And Carl Schuster was still there, Al Cohen was still there, Linda Smith was still there. They had a group of criminologists at Indiana. And then they had Jerome Hall in the law school, and then I had the computer, so it was ideal. I mean, it was a wonderful break just to go there. And I had no idea that that's what it would be. I mean, I guess I knew, of course, that Hall was there, and I knew Al Cohen was there. And Cohen's theory was very appealing. I read it at Wisconsin, and again, Clinard had talked about it when it was actually Cohen's dissertation at Harvard. And then by the time, before we even left Wisconsin, it had come out as a book, and I really liked it because he had this idea in there that said that the lower class kids, and he was very explicit about what he was doing. He was going to talk about lower class male gang delinquency. I mean, he didn't pretend to be talking about crime in general. And he suggested, of course, that the problems start when lower class kids run into middle class people, and middle class people want them to change, which is
what you had experienced in different aspects.
Yeah, I lived through that, and I knew the tension. I knew the tension that it caused, and that basically but he, his idea was that he brought in some psychiatric notion, and I'm not sure I agree with, but certainly what he describes, that tension, that these lower class kids are not really prepared to provide to earn the respect of middle class people, because they just don't have the kind of behavior. They're not quiet, neat, clean, all of the middle class things. So that kind of impressed me, and so it was kind of fun to actually study with Al Cohen. And Linda Smith was another one that had tremendous impact, because Lindy he focused on drug addiction, but he then ran into the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and their philosophy that the solution to the problem is to lock up addicts. And And Linda Smith felt that it was a medical problem and that they didn't need to be locked up. And so his confrontation and his work on the drug addiction, legal and medical approaches to drug addiction, had an impact. I mean, I really realized the folly of the drug war almost before it started. And so I'll come back to that because that's more.
That's a stream throughout your work.
That what?
Because that's one of the streams or topics in your work and connects.
Yeah, and I wish it were a bigger stream.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wish I really concentrated and talked about the drug war at different points, and I'll get to that when I get to the crime commission staff. But I don't know if I've touched on everybody that I want to make sure I mention at Indiana, because it wasn't at Wisconsin even. It was Lyle Shannon in delinquency. I mentioned Bob McGinnis. Frank Hartung came, and what was impressive about Frank Hartung was he came from Wayne State to fill in for Clenard. And so I was his teaching assistant rather than Clenard's that year. And I was so impressed with the guy because he explained how he got into the field. He said he was riding the rails out west, and he went into this library to get out of the heat. And he started reading, and he got interested. that was it. I thought, yeah, I like this guy, and he had very frank language too, which I could understand. I mean, not that I urge people to talk that way, but he made himself clear, and so I liked Frank. And then and again, Hans Gerth. I wanted to mention Hans Gerth because Hans Gerth had lived through in 2 countries and through 2 wars, and he just tremendous insights to hear him lecture. But one of the things I remember most, he said, you can't just read books, you got to fight with books. And I thought, yeah, that's right. You just can't take it, and assume it's right. Mark it up, put question mark. And so Gerth was good. But at Indiana, of course, one of the biggest influences was Carl Schussler, who directed my dissertation. In fact, I think Jim Short was one of the reviewers, and I think if he's told me once, he's told me several times that when he was reviewing it, he thought it was written by Carl Schussler. And I thought, well, that's understandable. That makes sense, And so but the other thing is, it's hard to say enough about the impact of Jerome Hall, because Hall, he taught criminal law, the theory of criminal law, but he also taught jurisprudence or philosophy of law courses, and he had this idea that any study of law worth its salt was a fusion of theory, fact, and value. And that's what so many criminologists miss, that it's a fusion of those things, and you can't just focus on the values, and you can't just focus on the theory. You have to put those things together, and that's really what I've tried to do, I think, in every piece. And sometimes the values don't come through strong enough, and sometimes they come through too strongly. But the point is, I was really impressed by that. And then there were other people at Indiana that I learned a great deal from, and of course, in an indirect way, one from by teaching a teaching assistant to Linda Smith, and he would bring in addicts to talk to the students, and one time I remember that the student said to the addict, well, if you could use it again, would you? Because they're released from prison, and one of the conditions is that they don't touch opiates, and the guy said, oh yeah, if God made anything better, I don't know what it is. And I thought, that was, enlightening. It's something there was a reason people use drugs, and it had little to do with the criminal law. Well, I mean, he was probably, I don't know, if he ended up back in prison or not, but that was a very compelling habit. And so, anyway, Linda Smith's attempt to make the system more humane, I think it was admirable. But if you were up against what became the Drug Enforcement Administration, it was then the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and you're some college professor, the chances of making a big difference are very small. But the fact that he made the effort, I really appreciate it. And I don't think I've lived up to that model, but I would like to. So let me just mention a couple of people, other people. Mel DeFleur and Frank Westy were teaching the methods courses, and in some ways I learned from them because they were kind of negative examples on occasion. You know, because I think they, in some ways, I don't know, I shouldn't talk about both in the same breath, but I think there were occasions when Mel DeFleur would present some idea he had for a project, and I would think, he's not taking into account the ethical aspects of this, the lack of ethics of this kind of research. And so, you know, that was the values that Paul brought with him. And then there was the other person I want to mention is Bill Chambliss. We were graduate students together, and Bill and Don Cressy and I always block on his name because C. Ray Jeffrey and I all took the outside minor in law, and we all studied with Jerome Paul, and we all came away with very different ideas. I think the ideas we went in with, we kind of came out with, I guess. I don't know, it's hard to explain.
And you continue to have a friendship and to co-author things with
Bill. Well, for years I wanted to write something with Bill, and then about 15 years ago we presented a paper in San Francisco at the Social Problems meeting, and it kind of died, and then we bring it back to life, and we've worked on it for about 15 years, and I think we're at a point where it might actually get published, but I won't be sure about that. But that would be nice, because I would like to have a paper with Bill. But let me stop there. I guess you've already asked some questions, but I want before I go into the Florida State, which was going to Florida State was also a big break. But am I said something that's confusing or?
No, perfect.
Okay, so.
And then was it when you were on sabbatical, or what led you then to Florida State? Because
it was my first job. I actually thought when I was a graduate student that I would go out and enjoy genteel poverty at some small college. I mean, I didn't really expect to make a lot of money, but the computer experience I guess that put me in a category for people at Florida State as somebody that would be appropriate in their methods. And of course, the methods I learned from Westy and DeFleur, which was very helpful to go to Florida State as methods and statistics and computing, and they soon. I think the computer experience really helped because almost everything I did work with the machines. But I did run into people, the graduate students many of the graduate students said, "Oh, poor Chilton, he's been captured by the machines." And that's what they felt about it. And then they said, they said, well, when I get out, I'll pay people to write programs. When I got to Florida State, there were people who would come out of Michigan State and other places, and they had maybe had that same notion that they would pay somebody or something. Anyway, they would come to me and say, "Would you help me write a program?" And I said, "Well, I'll help you learn the program, but I'm not going to write your programs for you."
Right.
And so, I was always looking on my back. I think as soon as people figure out what this stuff will do for you, they're all going to be doing it. So, anyway, I did have a lot of advantages. Going to Florida State was my first job, and so I was surprised at how much they were paying me, and then that they kept raising my salary, and it turned out that the whole field was going up. Everything was increasing, and when they hired somebody, they'd hire them at higher pay, and then they had the decency to raise my pay to the person they just hired. So it's like this is pretty neat. And then the director of I actually was in sociology, but I was in what was called the Institute for Social Research, and Charles Brigg headed that institute. And we had a slightly lower teaching load, and then we were obviously supposed to be engaged in research. It was an Institute for Social Research. But his approach was so relaxed that if he would come with something that we might put in for, and he'd say, "Are you interested in this?" And I'd look at it and I'd say, "No." And then he'd just go away, forget about it. And so, but in the process, I've been into some really interesting research projects. One was studying Florida suitable home law. And I don't want to go into it, but the gist of it was that the legislature had worked out a way to remove poor black women from the welfare rolls. And they were calling it a suitable home law. And so combining theory, fact, and value, I tried to do a very thorough factual study of the consequences of that law, and could conclude that what it did was make life harder for the poorest people in Florida. And to say that, and I think I only got it published because the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology is a student-edited. I mean, it's a law journal that students edit. And so, I'm not sure in mainstream criminology, even then, would have published something where the values involved are so clear, that it was so obvious that this was wrong, and the article said that. So it's not one of the most frequently cited articles, but it's one of my favorites. But the other thing, one of the people working on that was Louis Killian, and I'm going to say later that I don't want to get to any regrets I had, but that I did work more with Lou Killian on that project. But I also was there during the 60s, and so it was the Deep South. Tallahassee is just 15 to 18 miles from South Georgia, and so the civil rights movement was going on, the anti-war movement was going on. It was a very exciting time to be in Tallahassee, and we actually had great expectations. We thought things were going to change, and I think to a certain extent they did. And then we're getting the backlash, and I don't know what it would be like. But I like the physical part of Tallahassee because it's really a beautiful city, and but the political and social climate, and actually nobody in my family liked the physical climate. It was, I'd come out of the library and that warm, moist air would hit me and I'd feel good. And everybody in my family hated it because it's warm and humid so much of the year. And so the next big break was taking a year off in the middle of that stretch that I was at Florida State from 1962 to 70. But in the middle of that, 1966, I got a call from flocking on the. I already talked to Lloyd Olin. This is where I need the cheat sheet. But but Lloyd Olin called and he said, well, I should go into how I met Lloyd Olin. That the paper that came out of the thesis, when I wrote the first paper that came out of that, I presented at an ASA meeting in Los Angeles, and Lloyd Olin was the chair of that session, and so I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, I'd seen some of his work in Parole Prediction Table and so on, and so I didn't, like I said, make much of it. I did notice that one of the other presenters, one of the other presenters was so good at his presentation that he could read the paper and make it sound like he was just talking to you. And so I'll come back to him later because I'll remember his name. But it was very impressive. But the point was that through that contact, you run into people say, I hate meetings. Well, because I went to that meeting and was on that session, and when Lloyd was looking around for staff for the Crime Commission, he thought maybe I could be helpful. So he called and he said, would you like to come up for a year to Washington to work on the President's Crime Commission? And I said, would I ever? And so it was a really wonderful year, and I learned so much about outlining and organizing, and we'd have outline meeting after outline meeting, and we'd go over how we're going to put this assessment on. They didn't want to call it the Sociology Task Force, and so they call it the Assessment Task Force. And I still like that word, it's helpful. But at any rate, we tried to think of everything that we could that might be involved in reducing crime. And one of the commissioners, when the thing was first handed in, said, you haven't said anything about religion. And she was right. We had all these meetings, and we talked about everything that we should consider, and it didn't occur to any of us that we should consider the role of religion. And actually, since then, I think she was right in two different directions. I think we now see that religion causes a lot of violence, and but it also probably prevents a lot of violence. And I don't know why I didn't think of it, because all those people at Erie were religiously oriented, and so it was interesting though that that social scientists that just miss religion.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, that was a big break to be on the crime commission staff, because Lloyd had somebody told him involve everybody, or they'll criticize the report. So he got to meet every well-known criminologist practically in the country who came in and were involved in some way as consultants on that. And at that point, I also got to meet Al Blumstein, who you know from Uncovered. But at that point, he came as a systems analyst, and he kind of wasn't a criminologist. He's become a distinguished criminologist. But at that point, he came and he gave a little lecture, explained what systems analysis would do for the criminal justice system, and he had the example of a printing operation and the inputs and the throughputs and the outputs, and so he really, not alone, I'm sure, but really major figure in changing the way we looked at the administration of justice. He actually created, I think, he and his colleagues really created the notion of a system of justice. Now, it's maybe a digression, but I was familiar with the system analogy because of all the sociologists that wrote, the social system and tried to describe it in biological terms. Society lives and dies, and it depends on that it's a system, and one piece has it back for the other, and so on. I've been exposed to that kind of use of the analogy, but I hadn't thought of it as from an engineering aspect, where you could change pieces of the system and improve the throughput. But of course, the one thing the engineers didn't bring with them was any set of values. And maybe there are things we shouldn't be putting through the system.
Right.
That was not, and I think that we'll talk about it later. But I think that one of the problems the field has today is that there are too many people improving a system that, in many cases, the system needs to be changed, not the throughput. But anyway, we can talk about that. Certainly, being on the commission was a big break, and it actually led to my going to Massachusetts, because Lloyd Olin must have given my name to the chair at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who called, and he actually came to Washington, and we talked, and eventually I went up to visit and was offered a job. This was in '66. But I couldn't bring myself to go north. My job at the commission ended in January, and the thought of going north rather than back to Tallahassee was too much.
Enjoying the weather there.
Was too much. I really couldn't do it, and that was about 3 years later that when kind of things blew up at Florida State. Well, it blew up kind of everywhere in the late '60s. Well, it was Kent State. I mean, a real disaster. But anyhow, I decided I'd leave Tallahassee, and I unfortunately don't remember his name, but the president at the time, I thought his behavior was shameful in terms of bringing the sheriff's posse and arresting. And I lost a good book because I had loaned it to a student from Australia who was deported because he was a member of SDS, but the Students for Democratic Society. So anyhow, I decided to go to the UMass, but there were so many different ways that Florida State was important, because they had a good computing center, and they kept getting better and better computing equipment, and we had a system where finally you had professional operators. In Indiana, you had to go in the middle of the night and run the machine yourself, because we had IBM 650. I mean, that was okay, except sometimes somebody had broken a tape, or the card reader wasn't working. But then they all got professional, and you put the cards through the window. And this is why I really understand gamblers. I mean, I understand the motivation, because every time you put the cards through the window and you get them back the next morning, and then finally they got it down to an hour turnaround, you always figure you got a winner. That it's going to work this time. And then there's some little mistake, and you get it back, and you fix it, and you say, now I'm this is
No.
really a winner, see, and you get yourself involved in that in that sense. But they had really a good computing center, and so it was helpful. Now, the next big break was going to the University of Massachusetts. Although we really started on how I got into criminology, and I think we're into criminology now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can see that. But it was a series of breaks of getting to Florida, getting to Indiana was a break, and going to Florida State was a break, and then it turned out going to Massachusetts was a big break. And so I had a lot of help from a lot of people, and I know I'm forgetting the names, so I want to say this for anybody who helped me that I haven't named yet, that I would if I could remember. So they understand, because I really, at Florida, did I get everybody at Florida? Well, on the Crime Commission staff, for example, I mentioned Al Blumstein, but there were a number of other people that James Warrenberg was the director. And again, that was kind of a negative experience in a way. I mean, he's the executive director, so you're not going to be friends with him, but at one point I was going to give a paper down in Miami on crime statistics and how to improve them, and it had to be cleared with the director to send me down there. And he looked at it and he said, "Well, if anybody should give this paper, I should." I said, "Well, you want to go down, And so anyway, he said, "Okay, go ahead." And then the paper, by the way, was described by one of the discussants as what a lot of pious nonsense. Improved crime statistics, pious nonsense. But you can see that theory, fact, and value come into the field in a variety of ways. But then Henry Ruth was assistant to Warrenberg, and he was a very helpful, knowledgeable guy. Marty Timmon was another member of the assessment staff, and very easy to work with, very conscientious guy. Gene Muehlheisen was the director of the police task force, and I went to they had an organized crime task force. And I went to the head of the organized crime task force, and I said, "Are you going to talk about organized crime?" And he said, "Oh, we're just going to take a broad brush approach." So I went to Gene Muehlheisen and I said, "I don't think the organized crime people are going to take up police corruption. Are you guys going to take it up?" And Gene said, "Oh, Roland, we have to talk about that. Everybody knows that's wrong." And here it's like you could say that about all kinds of crime, But anyway, one of the people I really met was a young lawyer named Jerry Stern, and I actually shared an office for a short period of time because it was a great office. I liked it because it had a blackboard. He liked it because it had a flag. We both liked it because you look out the window, you had a real picture of the Capitol. I mean, it was really the Capitol. It wasn't a picture of the Capitol. It was the Capitol. And so we were sitting in there one day, and somebody with a higher GS ranking looked in, closed the door, and pretty soon we were reassigned. we lost it to somebody who thought that they deserved it better. But anyway, but Jerry did get the really serious part. What Jerry did was he was asked to look at public drunkenness as a crime and what to do about it. And so he, more than anybody else, I think, on that staff, got the commissioners to recommend that the police get out of the drunk business, get drunkenness out of the system. There was this huge revolving door. Somebody would be legally sold the amount of liquor, and they'd go out on the street and they'd wobble a little, and then they would be arrested, taken in, put in jail, and then taken to court and fined and thrown out, and the next day they'd come back in. So Jerry really got them to say, this is a waste of police resources. Let's have detox centers. Let's have other street cleaners that not put this on the police. And if I had the wit and the perspective that I have now, I think the volume we should have had was not public drunkenness as something to take out of the system, but we would have taken the drug war out of the system, which is the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of thing, except that the substances are not legal. We have people come to the crim meetings and they say things like, well, everybody should be tested. All of us, the whole audience of criminologists, we should all urinate in a little cup and have somebody tested to see if we've used some substance or other in the last 2 months. And And this is nonsense.
Yeah.
And I'd say to them, well, what about alcohol? And they'd say, oh, that's legal. As if the law,
Right.
you know, if you have a law, and as if we hadn't gone through where you had a law making it illegal. Except on that occasion, they didn't make possession and use illegal, they made manufacture and sale. And also, it was a lot easier to get out of that than when we got into the drug war over the last 40 years, 50 years maybe. We created this long list of illicit substances that people shouldn't be using because they're not good for them. And then we put them in jail for long periods of time, which I can't imagine why they think that's good for anybody. But anyhow, this is a soapbox I'll get off now. I'll come back to later. And so at any rate, the next big break was going to the University of Massachusetts and its computing center. And at this point, I do want to say something about the debt I owe my son, who got interested in computers, not surprisingly. I introduced him to the 101, and he was about 10 years old, and he was doing the plug board wiring and running the cards. And I said, if you like this, you'll love programming. And so eventually, I got a lot of help from him because he became, well, he's in computer business now, but software business. But at one point, he took the big reels of tape with all this UCR data and printed it out in a format that I could handle and work with. And at another point, I was at Arizona State on the visiting professor at Arizona State, and they had decided to buy PCs. This was 1984. They decided to buy PCs for everybody. And so they came in, they put this box down because it was for the person whose office I was using, who was off on leave. And I said, what's that? They said, it's a computer. So it was like Christmas time. Opening it up, could have set it up on the desk, but I didn't have the statistical software for it. So I wrote my son and I said, you know, he was working for an outfit which was producing APL software. APL means a programming language. It's a cult language. I was part of the cult for a while, but because I said I need the programming, and so he sent me the APL system to put on the PC. And of course, when I got back to UMass, I needed a PC, and so that was kind of another big break. And then actually he was even helpful when I was a visiting fellow at BJS, and I was working with the NIBRS data, and they had sent me the reels of tape had a section on them that the Stata couldn't read. I couldn't read the data. And so he wrote a very nice little Unix routine that I could put in and get over that hump and then work with the data. So I owe a lot to my son, but I shouldn't mention him without mentioning my daughter, who is also full of good advice. But it usually boils down, if I say, how do I put something on YouTube? She says, you're a college professor, you'll figure it out. So, but that's helpful. I mean, anyway, but UMass has been really tremendous. Again, Lou Killian, and maybe I should say this in a clear way. Lou Killian, it was very important in my coming to UMass. I mean, not that I hadn't been offered a job in '66, but when you decide to apply again 3 years later, the fact that Lou Killian had left Florida State, gone up to be the chair at Connecticut, and he was the chair at Connecticut at the year of Kent State at '69. And the faculty were all at each other. He said he had to go around taking nasty notes off doors so there wouldn't be fistfights in the hall. I mean, there was just a division on the war. And anyway, so then he left. He was chair and kind of preside over this thing, and so he left and went to UMass. So when I decided to try to apply again, obviously it was very important. At any rate, the other people, there were other people at UMass. And the director of the computer center was really important and really very helpful. And he's actually, he's 94 now or something, but he's still a friend of mine. But they were across the street neighbors, and at one point he had my son work as a high school student at the computing center, but not get paid. And so I'd kid him, I'd say, yeah, but you didn't pay him. And he said, but I didn't charge you either. so it was it was in every way a very useful experience. And I think I'll just skip over by saying there were really helpful people like T.O. Wilkinson and Jerry Platt and Randall Stokes. They were all at some point been chaired. And so, and I go to my next big break, which is the American Society of Criminology. And again, this is happenstance. This is luck. You go to the meetings and you enjoy meetings and you meet people, and then and then you already know people. I knew Bill Chambliss, and Bill Chambliss nominated me he kept, for all kinds of things. And so when Frank Scarpitti said, I need a program chair for the '81 meeting, he said, well, ask Roland, he'll do it. And so, I said, yeah. And had gone back to Florida State 10 years later as a visiting professor, but not in sociology, but down in the School of Criminology. And those people were so nice to me that I was just a visiting professor, but they gave me 2 RAs to help me put together the program for the meetings, and they paid the postage. I mean, it was really a really neat deal. And so I should not block on the name of the dean at that time, but there were a lot of, let's just say there were a lot of good people and certainly one of them was Ted Chirkos, who was there actually when I was in sociology, and he was a sociologist out of the University of Massachusetts, and has gone on to have a distinguished career. But the next big break, when Frank appointed me to be the secretary, he asked me to be the program chair, and at the end of that year, he got to appoint the secretary. And so he asked me to do that, and so then that was, I spent a lot of time as secretary of different things, because I was secretary of ASA for a couple of terms, and I was also secretary of the faculty senate at UMass. And so I came to the point where when everybody says, will somebody take minutes, I say, no, no, I don't do that anymore. But it was very useful experience, a very, I think, worthwhile activity. That somebody's got to keep track of what's going on, somebody's got to record what's going on. And being secretary was, I think, but also met a lot of people. So in terms of the lucky breaks that come from networking, then obviously it was helpful. Now, I wanted to mention Sarah Hall, because while I was the appointed secretary, Sarah Hall did the job that Chris Eskridge does now, but different, because she was a stenographer. And so if you want the minutes of a board meeting and you have a stenographer who's taking shorthand notes, she knew everything that everybody said. And the minutes aren't supposed to reflect what people said, they're supposed to reflect what the group did. But it was still very useful to have, she would transcribe them and type them up, and then I could pull out a set of minutes from those. So she was a very, very, very helpful in so many different ways. And then and again, like I say, Bill was helpful because he nominated me for vice president once, which I lost. I think some people thought I was vice president, because I think I ran for it twice. Maybe, I don't know. I lose track. But in any case, then I think he obviously nominated me for president. So it was, and in the process of being secretary, you saw the president work. And I remember Dan Glazer, and Dan is such a nice guy. I mean, he's a really very decent person. But for running a meeting, you drive you crazy. I mean, he just couldn't move it along, or wouldn't. I mean, he's too nice to say, is there any more to be said on this, and move on, But anyhow, Dan Glazer was really was impressive in that way. Oh, it was Gil Geis I was trying to remember. Gil Geis was impressive in both written and oral presentations, and he was one of the presenters at that first when I made the presentation in Los Angeles. He's the one that he wrote so well. He'd been a reporter, and he wrote so well that when he read his paper, it just sounded like he was talking to you. He had a knack for that. But the other watching, Ruth Peterson was vice president. I think she may become president. I think she's nominated. But I just got that at the People of Color and Crime meeting the other day. I'm not sure, but anyway. And of course, I think of Jim Short as a kind of an example of somebody who hangs in there. I figure, as long as Jim can make these meetings, I can make the meetings. And so, but he didn't make this one, so I don't know what that means. But anyway, I had actually run into Marvin Wolfgang on the Crime Commission staff. We can back up here. He was a consultant to Lloyd Olin, and Lloyd assigned the stuff that those of us on the staff wrote to a particular person to react to and critique. And so I feel like I was a kind of they're always big on mentors and mentees and stuff. I feel like I was a kind of mentee of Wolfgang, because I would write the stuff about the uniform crime reports, which he knew very well, and I'd get confused about whether it's $50 and over or up to $50, and it must have drove him crazy. Mark this stuff up and say, you have to get this right. And so I kind of really appreciated Wolfgang. So but there were so many people. I really can't name them all that were helpful in terms of my career. It's hard to I think we're probably getting ahead here. I'm going to let you ask some questions, because I'll talk about Homicide Research Working Group at some point, but not.
Okay, excellent. I'd love to hear about, of all the research that you've conducted, what are some of the projects that you're most proud of?
Yeah, I looked at that question, and I thought pride is not exactly the right term. I mean, I was really pleased early on to see that the dissertation article that I mentioned, an ASR article, that it was so frequently cited, and I wasn't sure why. And eventually it became cited, and the response was really citing it as an example of a mistake. And but that's the point of publication. I think we may have gotten to the point, and again I'm getting ahead here, but we may have gotten to the point where the field no longer allows people to put out a mistake. That you do the best you can. You write the article, and then some reviewers will say, oh well, you should have written this paper. I may be guilty of that myself, and it's when I review articles. Sometimes I think, gee, the really important thing here is this, and they're just ignoring it, and so. But I think if that becomes pervasive, it's a bad thing, because you want to let people write the article they want to write, and then if they're saying something wrong, the idea of the publication process that somebody knows something about it will then write an article correcting that and pointing out what the right direction is going. But in any case, like I say, I don't think I would say I was proud of it, but I really was pleased by the reception, and it probably was a big thing in making my career, right? Because it was cited often enough that in the book that Wolfgang and his colleagues wrote, published in 1979, they tried to assess criminology. So they had this question, what's the best criminological work that's been done in the last so many years? I don't know how far they went back. And so there was obviously an enormous, they had two ways to approach, a citation index, and then they had people do a qualitative review of the articles that they thought were best, even if they weren't cited. It was a nice idea, and some were in both lists and some weren't, and I only made the citation list, and just barely, because they went down to the halfway point, I guess, and it turned out that at that point, about number 80, the dissertation article was cited, and so I was on the list, and I thought, well, that's pretty neat, because I just started out. I used to run into people at meetings, and they'd say, I thought you were an old man. I mean, this was when I was a young man. I mean, now they have met an old man, but I mean, but when I wrote that article, I was still fairly young, and so so the fact that it got so much attention. But I think the one I'm really proud of probably didn't get a lot of attention, and that's that one where it looked at the suitable home law and its consequences. I mean, that to me, that's the kind of work that I think I should be doing and doing more of. Not that I've done enough of it. But I actually want to mention Chris Chris Smith here because Chris is, as you know,
Yeah.
Chris, she's one of our current students in the sense she's one of the few people interested in criminology at UMass these days.
Yeah.
And so I was talking to her, and I was explaining that I was going to do this interview, and I said, they want to know about my career, and I don't really know how to get a handle on it. And she said, oh, just Google to cover yourself. and so I did that, and oh, she did it. Actually, she did it. She gave me the list, and it's just it's kind of truncated here, but it's okay. It's the 9 most frequently cited articles of my work, and actually I don't think the article that I really liked makes the list, but. One of the things, if I look at the list, there are 9 articles here cited. For the top was cited 168 times, the other 22 times. But on these 9 articles, there are 6 co-authors, and so I really want to mention the co-authors. One of them was Gerald Markle, and he was a graduate student at Florida State, and he was assigned to me as a teaching assistant. But he had been a biology student, so he came into my office and he said, let's not fool around with this teaching assistant stuff, let's do some research together. I said, okay. And I had data, and I had the data because of another really important person in some ways in my life, was a guy named Ali Keller. And he was the director of the Florida Division of Youth Services. And he was looking for somebody that would, under that heading, he got the juvenile court reports, and he had to develop some kind of a statistical reporting program. And so he's looking for somebody to do that. And I said, I would do it for the data. If I could have all the data, I would do it. And he said, no, he said, I've discovered that it's better if you pay people. He didn't, just volunteers, he didn't think was very reliable. You can't fire them, or you can't really do much. So I said, okay, put some money in. Charlie Reagan, he and I got together. We put some money into the institute. I get the data, and you get the work. so Holly Keller was important. That meant that I did have data on these juvenile court referrals. And so I said to Jerry Margo, let me see if I can make sure I got the right article here. This was the family disruption, because one of the things that comes out in the juvenile court statistics that a lot of these kids come from what we used to call broken homes. And looking back over it now, some of those kids probably, it wasn't any home to break. I mean, there were a lot of mother-child families probably, and I'm not sure how we coded that. I mean, it's a long time ago. I think we're talking about an article we wrote in, what is the date on this thing? 72. So, I don't remember it that well, but I remember the experience of having a graduate student say, let's not fool around here, let's do something worthwhile. And so that's the second most cited article. And so I want to recognize Jerry Markle, and then another one that's up there on the list is the one I did with Susan Datesman on gender, race, and crime, and that was a marvelous collaboration because we decide who's going to take this piece, who's going to take this piece, and what she said she was going to do, she did, and I think she was the one that said, let's put it in Gender and Society. I don't think I even knew about the journal, and so I'm really kind of now proud to have an article in Gender and Society. I don't know whether Gender and Society is proud about it, but at any rate, that was another. And one of the other, in a way, another one is John Jarvis, and I haven't mentioned the Homicide Research Working Group. This might be a good time to do it. Because.
How did you get involved with the homicide?
That was. Did I tell you that? The accident. I told you about the call. Where.
Right.
Where Mark Rydell called, and I went to that meeting there at Quantico, and at that Quantico meeting, this is when John Jarvis was with UCR before he went to the FBI Academy, and he told us about that data that we couldn't have, but by the next year he was bringing data, and pretty soon we were working together, and we published a couple of articles together using the NIMERS data, comparing it with the victimization survey and so on. And so that's another one that makes the list because but John Jarvis was very important in that. And then the one with Adele Spielberger, again using the delinquency data, and here I really lost track of exactly who led me to this, but it was certainly Welford and one of his colleagues, Charles Welford, one of his colleagues. While I was on the Crime Commission staff, they submitted something that was an age-specific analysis of crime. So since we had this Florida data, and there was this tremendous increase in the number, the question was, would an age-specific analysis indicate that delinquency was really increasing, or was just a reflection of an increased number of people in the delinquency age groups? And so Adele Spielberger was, she was not faculty and she wasn't a graduate student. She was kind of somebody working in the Institute for Social Research. She's a very bright woman. Her husband's on the psychology faculty. And so she wrote that article with me, and that worked out very well. The others are basically graduate students, Jan Diamikis, and there I got to do something that had to do with drugs and over-criminalization. That is the use of the criminal law in areas where it really doesn't work well. And so we at least got that in the title, but we were basically looking at the seriousness scores that Wolfgang had developed. So I don't think, I hope I haven't missed anybody here. Well, I'm sure I have. One person I've missed is Dee Weber. And she was like Adele Spielberg. She had been a graduate student, but decided she really wasn't interested in pursuing a PhD, and she just rather work with helping people with their data. Is this going on too long? No? Anyway, Dee Weber and I organized, took and reorganized a set of UCR arrest data to make it more usable. And for a while it was. I think ICPSR, which I got to get somewhere in here, is another important lucky break, is finding use of ICPSR. But I think somewhere there might have changed it, made it hard to use again. But for a while it was very easy to use. And so a number of students were using that data and then citing the source. And so it shows up as if we had written a paper. Dee and I never wrote a paper together, but we did work on that data. People did use the data, and they cite us as the source of the data. So that's a kind of an interesting thing. I don't know. Getting back to the original question is what I'm most proud of. It's like I say, I don't think pride is. It's the fun I had doing it, and especially running the data. I don't know, I may have told you in some of our earlier discussions that slow. And there are people that are really quick, fast. They can do all kinds of things in a hurry. It doesn't come easy to me, and so in a way, what I'm always torn between is, should I sit down and write something now, or should I make another run? Because part of the fun is analyzing the data, and there's always another question you can ask of the data. And so I didn't mention back when we were talking about people at Indiana, Norwood Russell Hanson. He was a philosopher of science, but he gave a lot of public lectures, and he was very influential because he, for my work, because he introduced me to the concept of retroduction. There's induction and deduction, and I don't think he invented it, but he was very big on retroduction, which is a system whereby you look at a set of data and you see what would it take, what kind of theory would it take to explain this data. And so you start with the data, so it's inductive in that sense, but you're really trying to say, what kind of theory. This isn't really that different from what Cressy and Linda Smith were doing in what they called analytic induction, and that goes way back. But their approach was quite different. They'd say you look at a set of data, you formulate a theory, then you look at another case, and if that doesn't fit, you modify the theory. And the question is, when do you stop looking at cases? But I think his was comparable to that, the retroduction notion, because what you're doing is you're starting with the data and you say, what kind of theory would explain this? And to me, that's just been a more attractive approach than taking some theory that somebody thought up without looking at any data, but because it modified somebody else's theory.
Mhm.
And anyway, I don't want to be too hard on theorists, or I'll get hate mail or something. Anyway, where are we?
Well, what would you say are the identifying characteristics of your work? How would you identify yourself as a scholar?
Well, I don't know if it's, I don't know, maybe people wouldn't consider it scholarship, but I think the driving theme in my work is that we need more and better data. And that that's not my idea. I'm trying to think of the name of the person that I got it from, but it was a prominent criminologist giving a presentation at ASA, and he said, we don't need any more crummy theories. We just need more and better data. And I thought, boy, he's got that right, And so, and not that theories are necessarily crummy, but there's probably an excess of theory relative to what we actually know, what we could actually test, and what we could say is true. And so, I'd say that would be if anybody said, what is it about Chilton and his work, I'd say, well, he just has a long-standing commitment to improving crime data and the need for more and better data. I suppose the best work on this is and I'm blocking out his name now, but it'll come to me. He and somebody else wrote the book Crime is Not the Problem. Franklin Zimmering. Franklin Zimmering and I forgot what his co-author was.
I'm not remembering.
Okay, anyway, they wrote a book called Crime is Not the Problem, and people kind of took that literally. What they really were saying was that in the United States, if you take out violent crime, our crime rates are not that different from other industrial countries, but that where we excel is in violence. And that was the point he was trying to make, that we should be looking at violence. And people responded to that like saying, "No, crime is the problem." It's kind of missing the point. Yeah, missing the point, taking that line. I mean, what he was saying is, crime in general is not the problem. It's very specific kinds of crime we should be focused on. Anyway, so I think I've been influenced by that in my later work, and also I think one of the big breaks was finding the NIBRS data, because this is a source of information on the incident. It's incident-based, meaning that you start with the incident and then you ask what information you have about the offender, if any, what information you have about the victims, and so you can have both victim and offender information and the offense information, and so that there's a tremendous amount of information that the law enforcement officer keys in as they respond to a call for service. So obviously there are going to be some mistakes in it, but the idea is that you could then really talk about offenders and victims, and I think too often in criminology people get lost on that score, and you don't know whether they're talking about offenders or victims, and frequently they really are talking about victims, and they think they're talking about offenders. And if you use the offenses known to the police, that's really a victim file, because these are offenses, and if a robbery comes to the attention of the police, it comes because there was a victim that called it in. So it's really victim data. But in NIBRS, if the victims and witnesses gave any information about the offender, you would also have some information about the offender. So you could not only make the distinction, you should make the distinction. So, well, I said should, but that's the values coming in.
What would a perfect data set look like to you? How could it be improved? What would be the ideal data?
Oh, that's a great question. As to what. Let me see if I can find the limitations of, say, what I think is now the best data available. It probably comes from the NIBRS. But I just recently read a study that took place in Finland where they use a series of registries. Now, a registry is an official source of information, and in this country, probably the easiest, the most useful. Let's say you're interested in social class and crime, and so you want to know income and occupation, maybe if you can get education. Now, the source of the education might come from the census. The best source of employment data is held by the Social Security Administration, and they know who's working and how long they've worked and how long they've gone. And the best source of income data is IRS.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we consider those registries, and we say we're going to take a random sample of residents of the United States, and we're going to take information from each of those 3 registries, and then we're going to ask the UCR to tell us from their records of arrest and prosecution which of these people have been arrested and prosecuted for what.
Mm-hmm.
Then you could talk about you don't get into the thing you get into with the survey where victimization survey, say you call people up and you ask them what their income is, and they say, no, I'm not going to tell you that. In fact, they really are over the, I don't know if it's true exactly now, but for the last 5 years, they weren't reporting the income of victims because they weren't getting the information from victims. See, now, if you had this set of registries, you wouldn't have the missing data, and you could redo the victimization survey. You could look at a number of questions about people who were offenders. Yes, you could look at offenders and victims, and you wouldn't have the missing data on things. You'd have more than age, race, sex. You'd have some serious income data, and you'd have some serious employment data.
Yeah.
So, if I were saying, and so you probably guess what the problem is. The problem is that under our law, these agencies cannot share information. They can't give each other information, and it may be getting worse in that sense that there's so many pressures on CDC that they're even cracking down on providing geographic indicators, which means if I want to know how many people were reported as homicide victims or suicide victims in the public health data, I can get it for the whole country, but I don't know what's happening in Peoria or New York or Chicago. And that information has been removed since 2005. It was available up to then. So, but your question, what would a perfect data set look like? It's a good question. I just don't know if I could answer it. But it's certainly, you'd hope there are possibilities for representing more than a very small set of people. And I think you hope that there was that it amounted to more than a survey in which you have to rely on the people answering to answer honestly, and especially a self-report survey, which it became hugely popular in sociology and criminology, and it still is, I suppose. I mean, I go to sessions now where the measure of crime is what the kids told them to do, and we had. I had some indication of the problems with that when they were doing a series of a lot of concern for drug use in the Amherst schools, and so they finally got so that maybe they could do a survey of the Amherst high school kids and their drug use. But of course, the school committee wanted to carefully monitor what kind of questions you ask them. But the most interesting thing about it is when reporters went to these kids afterwards and said, when they ask you those questions, do you tell the truth? And you know what some of the kids said. Some of them said never, and other kids said all the time. So you just don't know. You just don't know. And so I think a really good data set, it would be a set of data sets where you can actually clock one against the other, where you actually get you get some kind of triangulation that so you're not depending on just what the person said, or just what the registry said, but you have both of them. That's about all I can do with that. That's a really good question, though.
Well, my next question is related to that, about your general thoughts about the field, maybe directions it should go, things that maybe...
Yeah, it's like the question that they talked about advice to young people and so on.
Yeah.
One of the problems is as you get old, you get this, you run it, in the Marine Corps, the phrase was, it's not like the old Corps. It's a kind of, you're looking down at what's going on now because, we did it differently then. And so it's really hard to say where the field should go. But from my perspective, taking a theory, fact, value perspective on it, especially focusing on values, I think we may have drifted too far into trying to accommodate people enforcing laws that shouldn't be enforced. It shouldn't be laws in the first place. So, for example, you know, if I say I think I'd like to be known for a person interested in more and better data, I guess what I'd really like to be known for is a person who has persistently and consistently pointed out the folly of our drug war. I mean, I think our drug war is a travesty. It's more than a travesty. I mean, we have locked up so many people for things that are not dangerous in the name of the drug war, that we've created this huge industry, which we're just now starting to take apart. I was at a session yesterday where California has reduced the numbers of people in their prison by about half, just by taking out non-violent and offenders and drug offenders, and figuring we don't need to keep those people locked up.
Right.
And so, I wish I'd done more on that score and worked harder to make people aware. I mean, anybody that's listening that wants to see a stab at this that I made was to look at my presidential address, as they called it, in 2000. And if you look there, you'll see that I really define what I mean by folly, and I really suggest that we ought to be out of that business. So, but in answer to your question, what should the field be doing? I really hope that there will be some kind of section or some kind of group that says the legislature should revise the criminal code every 10 years. And they should look at it to make sense out of it. Now, this was the original idea that Judge Frankel had when he recommended the Sentencing Commission. As far as when I read his book, and I reviewed it at the time that it was published, which was like in the 70s sometime, but it never got published because they found a better reviewer. I don't know. Anyway, but the point is, I did the review, I read the book, and it was worth doing. And Frankel had some really good examples of places where the law itself was irrational. You know, like a penalty for kidnapping a dog is more serious or heavier than penalty for killing a dog. I mean, you can see the logic, and if you kidnap a dog, you better kill it because you're going to get off easier. But that kind of, but what he was pointing to was, he thought there were lots of examples where a sentencing commission could look at and rationalize the criminal law. Now, it could be that the new punishment or corrections and sentencing division, I don't know enough about their work. It could be that they're doing this kind of work where they're saying what we should be doing is taking a particular state, looking at its criminal code, and suggesting places where it's irrational. It doesn't make sense. Now, the legislature makes the law, so it doesn't mean that somebody suggesting to them a really rational criminal law would make a lot of headway. But I think it would be worth the effort. So if you say where should it go? I think there really should be more of that, and we may have drifted into a situation where the only value statement you can make in criminology. We went through this with the debate on should we condemn the death penalty, and I think it was again Frank Zimmering that said, he quoting Lincoln, if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong, and certainly if the death penalty isn't wrong as a rational approach to misbehavior, nothing is wrong. But in any case, I lost track of the thought there. What was the question again?
About where the field should be spending attention.
I think there really should be more people asking the question, not can we help people operating the system of justice, improve their work and be more efficient, but are there ways in which we can give them advice to stop doing things that they're doing that don't make sense? And so that instead of people putting in for more money to study drug courts, somebody should be saying, does this make any sense? Why do we have drug courts? We have drug courts because we don't want to fill up the criminal courts. And then and you say, why are we filling up the criminal courts with drug cases and just diverting them to another court? Does that make any sense? In other words, what I'm saying is, I hope, I would hope that the field would go more in the direction. Now, this is a really unlikely hope, because I think the current direction, which is could be characterized as a shift from criminology to criminal justice. The current emphasis is on trying, just assuming that the law as it stands is good and right, and there's no such thing as unjust law. As Jerome Hall called it bad law, and it's inconsistent with our basic documents, our basic philosophy. And I think Martin Luther King called it there's just law and unjust law. And so, I sure hope that if we go back, if we get into situations where people are putting people in jail for wanting to vote, that we won't have criminologists trying to rehabilitate them or suggesting rehabilitation or putting in for grants to, study rehabilitation. You know what I'm saying? There are things that we ought to be doing and things we ought not to be doing. And I came away, I guess about 2 years after I was president, I came away with the feeling that as a society, American Society of Criminology, there's only one ought. There's only one value question that people can agree on, and that is the government ought to give us more money to do more research. Even though we can't agree on what that research suggests that the government ought to do, or we're kind of unwilling to question the current. It's probably changing. I'm probably off the mark here, and it's probably changing. I think more and more people will say, having the more our population per capita locked up than any other country in the world does not make sense. And I think even conservative politicians now are looking at the cost of that, and they're really looking, I think, at the cost of having a death penalty as opposed to not having it. There were studies done in North Carolina and other places that showed how much a death penalty, the average death penalty cost, and why it was more expensive to have a death penalty than not have it. And when I presented that in class sometimes, students who kind of had a gut feeling in favor of the death penalty would say, but you don't want to make this on money ground, on economic grounds. You don't want to make. But I think it's possible that contemporary conservatives will
appeal to them.
It'll appeal to them. We may get rid of the death penalty in states we didn't think we could. Although I was talking to Gordon Waldo, who was at Florida State when I was there, and he's now retired, but he's a lobbyist at the Florida legislature trying to get rid of the death penalty, which is a really worthwhile effort. But I think he and I both agree that the likelihood is slim, although there is this possibility that there will be enough people recognizing the cost. So, I don't know. That's another tough question, and one anybody should be hesitant to answer is that is where should the field be going? I mean, the field's going to go where it goes, but I hope we have a compass, in some direction.
Absolutely, and a theme through the interview so far is you've talked a lot about change the system. We need to change parts of the system.
Oh yeah, I really believe that. I think you can't just assume because it's the law that it has to be the law. Those people are going around with the dust drug testing and things. I just have trouble understanding what's going on in their heads. I guess they might really believe that substances other than tobacco and alcohol, which are very dangerous. This is actually one of the advantages of growing up at Erie. Those people that came in, they said, "Don't drink, don't smoke," and they were right. And probably lengthened my life that I never started smoking. I wouldn't even go into a tavern to buy my mother a bottle of beer. I just, I really believed them and took it seriously, and was a teetotaler for a lot of my life. Now I had a drink now and then, but I really don't enjoy it. I mean, I don't really drink that much. I certainly don't want to incapacitate myself. But what I'm saying here is that we spend all this money getting people to buy alcohol, and now it's on television. You get all kinds of alcohol ads on television, sophisticated ads, and then we lock people up because they use another mood-altering substance, which in some cases is not nearly as dangerous. And so you kind of have to. It drives me back to my early cynicism. You remember? I think it was the character in Lily Tomlin's play who said, "No matter how cynical I get, it's not enough." And you sometimes feel that way when you see the direction we're going, and the thing we do as a society, and the numbers of people that we lock up, and the reasons we lock them up, and then the characteristics of the people locked up, and of course I've heard a number of really good talks at this session about that, and I think actually I think it was Young, Ambassador Young, in his talk pointing out that things shift, and this may be changing, and we may actually see people in Congress who are not there to undermine things, the programs that are good for people, but actually support them. And instead of closing down the government, actually increasing the government's help in a number of areas. So he was kind of optimistic, and I think, I guess that's the duality in me. I'm really an optimist. I'm really an optimist.
With a lot of
but a lot of, let's say, skepticism. I think, but sometimes it comes out as a kind of a feigned cynicism. You know, when you say things like, "Well, you can't trust anybody, even your own mother," and that's really not fair. You know, for a woman that had moved 18 times in 21 years and had 10 children. I don't know if I got that in, but I have the 6 brothers and 5 brothers and 4 sisters. And so my idea of hell is solitary confinement. Maybe I shouldn't say that in public. Somebody will think I deserve it or something. But anyhow, but the point is that's about it.
Well, Roland, I want to thank you tremendously for doing this interview, and I always learn so much from you each time we talk. And one of my lucky breaks is being in an office right next door to you.
Right, and I was going to say I've over the years I've enjoyed talking to you. You remember when you first interviewed at UMass and you said.
I remember I was showing maps of the near west side of Chicago.
Yeah, and I said I went to Crane Tech, and you said you went to Crane Tech because 30 years later the whole area was different. But I lived in, that was one of the areas we lived in West Monroe Street, just west of Western Avenue. I took the streetcar to Crane Tech, and so we have a kind of a lot in common, at least in our affection for Chicago.
Absolutely.
Anyway, it's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland.